Morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
See you all is here.
So maybe we start with the opening verse for the talk. Dharma incomparably profound and infinitely subtle is rarely met even in 100,000 million kalpas. Now we see it, hear it, receive and maintain it. May we completely realize the Tathagata's true meaning.
So I just want to preface this by saying I might have to jump up and close the window if my neighbor starts using his leaf blower, which he occasionally does on Saturday mornings. So bear with me. My name is Katsuzen. I'm a longtime student of Kwang Roshi's. I live in Windsor, just north of Santa Rosa, and first studied with Kwang Roshi when I was getting a teaching credential, bilingual teaching credential at Sonoma State. And Roshi, a lot of you know, was teaching a psychology of Zen class in the psych department, but also teaching at the Zen Center. So one day a week we'd be at college, and then one day it always alternated. So one day at school and one day at the Zen Center. So it's really a really excellent way to be introduced to the teaching and to meet Roshi, of course. And I've been with him as a student since that time. I did get my teaching credential. I taught as a bilingual teacher and retired about 10 years ago, the time I got ordained. And shortly after that, I started the Windsor Sitting Group and still maintain my connection with Roshi and the Sangha. One thing I wanted to mention was in thinking about this talk, for quite a while I was saying that I would probably focus on, our relationship to these situations we've been encountering, these disasters. And for me, it almost seems like it's been following me around. There was the Tubbs fire. That was in 2017. And then after that, the Kincaid fire. The Tubbs fire was, and it was just a firestorm that blew through. And of course, affected the whole area, but the Zen Center as well. And then the Kincaid fire, which burned just to the east of me. It's actually where I teach school. I teach school part-time now. And it started close to where my school is and burned the whole valley, but fortunately didn't burn our school. And then this recent fire was the Wallbridge fire. So those two fires started on the east of us. The Wallbridge fire started on the west and burned toward our city. The other two fires we had to evacuate, and this one we were on the edge of evacuating. So it's like from all directions. And then when I was in Japan, I went and trained at Toshoji for a month. And I've mentioned this before, but when I first arrived at the temple, uh, a huge storm struck and it rained. I mean, it rained constantly for 3 or 4 days. There was no let up. And I thought, geez, this is, is this how these are the storms in Japan? It's like, and what happened, we didn't realize it, but a large dam broke in a nearby town and many people were killed. And it was part of our job to leave the temple and go down and do recovery work and clean a couple Zen temples that had been pretty much destroyed. So it's like it's been very prescient, I guess is the word. And now, of course, with the pandemic. But I heard a teacher mention that Dogen didn't really, even though he, and Nyoze had touched on this last week, that during Dogen's time, there were many natural disasters, political conflicts and wars happening. But in the Shobogenzo, Dogen doesn't talk a lot about this. I don't know that it's even mentioned. And it made me think, his temple was burned because of the existing Buddhist culture at that time. They tried to chase him out and he went to Eiheiji to find refuge. But still, he didn't talk about that very much. And there's only one instance that I'm thinking of that he did mention, and I wanted to read this to you. This is from one of his informal talks, and I think I'll just read it. It's a story of the poor man and the medicine Buddha's halo, and it was transcribed by his disciple, Eijo. A man came to the monastery and said, "My family's very poor. We haven't eaten for several days. The three of us, my wife, son, and myself, are starving to death. Please show us your compassion and help." At the time, Eisai was abbot of Keninji, and the monastery had little food, clothes, or supplies at the time. So Eisai, I don't know if I mentioned, he was actually the Dogen's first teacher. He was in the Tendai school, but I think a Rinzai teacher, and Rinzai was an early Zen teacher in Japan, very renowned. So he was at Kenenji at this time, and Eisai recalled a copper sheet that was to be used as the halo for the medicine Buddha statue. He broke off a large piece of the sheet and crumbled it up and gave it to the poor man, saying, "Please use this to buy food and satisfy your hunger." The man left overjoyed. And the students were upset. They said, "That copper was for the radiance of the Buddha's image. Isn't it a crime to give such sacred material for the medicine Buddha to a lay person?" Eisai said, "Yes, it may be a crime, but think of Buddha's intention. He gave up his own flesh and bones and offered them to sentient beings. He would honor Buddha's intention, even if it were to give the entire medicine Buddha to those who are starving. We may fall into hell for this act. Still, we should continue to save people from starvation." Dogen commented saying, "Students today should reflect on the great heart of our guiding master, and we must remember Eisai's example and his great compassionate heart. Don't forget this." So there's ways we can respond. Of course, we can respond through our practice, but also physically responding too when the need arises as bodhisattva action, as bodhisattvas in the world. Some people say, "Well, what can I do?" But yes, there's things we can do, always things we can do to help. I wanted to read a little from the study groups, the book we've been studying in the study group. This was the section on Dogen's commentary on the Mahaprajnaparamita, and it ties in with the act of giving. And he's talking about paramita here, paramita, Mahaprajna paramita. Paramita is translated into Chinese as Dun. Sorry, hard for me to see it. Means to cross over. In Mahayana Buddhism, this means to cross over from the shore of delusion to the shore of enlightenment, and not only to ferry oneself across, but also to ferry all others across as well. Paramita also means perfection. Sawaki Roshi expressed these dual meanings of paramita as a way of life in which we have reached the point we have to reach. All of us, without exception, are life as the life that permeates all beings. Wherever we go, we live out our own self. Instead of living in comparison with others, I live my own life. This is prajna paramita, perfection of wisdom. The first of the 6 paramitas is dana paramita, or perfect or unconditional giving. It does not mean to give something to others that ends up belonging to us. In reality, we are living out the self that is only the self. The you in front of my eyes is part of myself. If you are there in need of something and I am here with some extra of it, since fundamentally there are no personal possessions, I just move it a little bit from here to there. This is dana paramita. It is completed within the self that is only the self. There's no separation between myself and others. There's no private property in the all-inclusive self. And he goes on to talk about the other paramitas of keeping of the precepts and perfection of patience, perfection of diligence. In summary, paramita means this: the true self manifests the true self and completely lives out that self. And then the following section I wanted to read as well, because he's talking here about Shikan. And when I read this, I was really touched by what he was saying. And it kind of opened a big door, because in our expression, Shikan, we say Shikan Taza. I've always thought of it. He mentioned it in one of his, in How to Cook Your Life, Refining Your Life, instructions to the Zen cook. He described Shikan as doing one thing completely, one thing at a time. And when we sit, we just sweep, we just clean, we just listen, we just talk. But there's a whole history and dimension to Shikan, and so I wanted to read this. In this, so he gives the first sentence of the paramita: the time of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva practicing profound prajna paramita is the whole body clearly seeing the emptiness of all 5 aggregates. It's the emptiness of ourself and the emptiness of others, right? We're interbeing. In this first sentence of the text, we have to examine the Japanese names for 2 different Chinese translations of the Sanskrit name Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. One is Kanji Zai Bosatsu, and the other Kanzeon Bosatsu. And we have to examine the meaning of kan in those names. Kanji Zai Bosatsu is a translation by Genjo. Often kan is used as a compound with shi, as in shikan. In this case, shi is a translation of the Sanskrit term samatha, single-pointed concentration. And kan is a translation of the Sanskrit term vipassana, or insight. In the Tendai school, for instance, there are two texts on meditation, one called Mahashikan, which translates as the larger Samatha Vipassana, and the other called the Shoshikan, or the shorter Samatha Vipassana. Here, Shikan refers to Zazen. A little more detail, shi means to stop doing everything, right? To stop. In my own expression, I call it letting go of thought or opening the hand of thought. We always grasp things with our thoughts. When we stop doing that, we let go of thoughts, and what we have been grasping falls away. Though the thoughts do spring up again repeatedly, thoughts are secretions of the brain, which is of course also a part of our life. To see that these secretions are nothing other than secretions is kan, is insight. Usually we act basing our actions on those thoughts. We live, so to speak, for the sake of these secretions of the brain. Many people say that they live for the sake of seeking happiness, as if they know what happiness is. But what is happiness? Happiness is nothing more than what we feel when we have joy or pleasure in our mind. What we call happiness is merely the condition in which our desire for self-satisfaction is fulfilled. So he's referring to more of a self-centered kind of satisfaction. This is the root of our confusion. What do we human beings live for? Until recently, there were quite a few people in the East who thought they lived for the sake of the Buddha Dharma, and people in the West who lived for the sake of God's will. Such people saw God or Buddha as the absolute supreme value in their lives. However, these days, people have begun to think that God or Buddha exists only in the world of myth and fairy tale. Not many people find value in God or Buddha. So ultimately, people live for the sake of their own happiness. Human beings these days can be motivated only if we can convince them that something will improve their standard of living and will fulfill their desire for self-satisfaction. Nevertheless, happiness or better standard of living or a prosperous society are concepts, just secretions of the brain. We are living upside down if we find meaning of our lives solely in fulfilling desires that are based on these secretions. Kan is to understand this well and see thoughts just as thoughts. See secretions simply as secretions, neither more nor less than that. See everything as reality of life just as it is. This is Kan. Mm-hmm. To practice profound prajna paramita means to actually do it, to carry out the perfection of wisdom in our daily lives. We often take the phrase only as words without putting it into practice. Right now I'm talking about prajna or wisdom, not practicing, but this talk is practice. It is not so easy to distinguish what is practice from what isn't. In short, to practice means to actually live out the life of Kanji Zai Bosatsu in its true meaning. Thank you. So I wanted to say a few things about kind of what I've been up to lately. One thing I've been doing is I have a little day job, part-time job as a census taker, a Buddhist census taker, enumerator. We're called enumerators. And there's 250,000 of us out there. But it's kind of a nice flexible job, and it's kind of winding down now, but it's been very interesting. What we do is it's follow-up work for the people who haven't turned in their census information. And what we do, we have to count, we have to interview people in the various houses. We get addresses, got the smartphone, and I'm fumbling around with it to interview people at various places. And it happens that they gave me primarily addresses right around my house. So it's been interesting because this whole, since March 17th, like in the beginning, it was very much, it almost felt, it was like a retreat for me. I wasn't going out much. I would maybe take a walk and not driving very little. I think Santa Rosa was about as far as I went. And then I was kind of thrust into this. I thought it would be earlier in the spring when I signed up for it, or in the early summer, but turned out it was right when school was starting for me. So it was a bit of a challenge, but the interesting thing was going out and meeting people and not really knowing what to expect. And I found quite a few interesting experiences and people. One fellow, on one of those really hot days, I was out east Windsor, and there was a guy way down the road. I was out in the country, and he's riding a bike, and he finally comes into focus, and I happened to park right in front of his house. I was going to another address, and he came up to me, and he kind of confronted me. He said, "What are you doing? Are you for Trump? You look like a Trump supporter." I go, hey, no, man, I'm just I'm working for the government. And he seemed kind of angry about it. And he says, "Are you Black Lives Matter or White Lives Matter?" And I go, "Well, Black Lives Matter." And it seemed to calm him down a little. And then he got to talking, and he says, "Yeah, I'm Black Lives Matter too." And then he says, we talked a little bit more, and he says, yeah, he really admired Ronald Reagan. I'm, wow, okay. So I'm trying to figure this guy out. And eventually he calmed down, and he was in bitter spirits. And we left. He said, "Come back. I'll give you a beer. We'll talk again." So I was off to my next house. But what I found, I think, from one thing that really struck me, like right near my home, there's a little group of houses I didn't know about, and this land was donated by the owner of the property, and she gave small houses, and they brought in some small houses, and these people are refugees from the fires. The first woman I interviewed she lost her home in Coffey Park, which was a neighborhood totally destroyed in the Tubbs fire. And then the next woman I interviewed, she lost her business also in the Tubbs fire. And her husband he was in his 70s and just hadn't come back from the hospital from an operation. And so there was just a number of these people, like a woman, Hispanic woman who living by herself, and she had 4 kids, and had a really bad migraine at the time. But she didn't want to be interviewed, but she came away feeling better. She was smiling at the end, so something worked. I tried to be compassionate, and my son deals with migraines, so I talked to her about that. So anyway, that I think what was impactful was the fact that there's so much suffering right in our own neighborhoods. You know, we think, wow, it's out there, over there, and it's probably prevalent all over. It's like, you know, the Buddha told someone who lost a close relative, I think a woman who had lost her husband, and he said, go to a house and collect a seed. You know the story. And anyway, from someone who has not lost someone in your family, and she went to every house, and no one had not lost someone. So it was very universal. So how are we doing on time? Yeah, I have a few other things. Let's see. I wanted to say a little also about Zoom, because that's something I've been doing, Zooming. I'm feeling a bit like a Zoom zombie, Zoom zombie. But it's been a good opportunity, but it's not, I've been Zooming in Spanish, and I've been able to Zoom with the Comunidad Budista de Mexico, and they've had a couple very large meetings of the Buddhist groups, and then just recently an interreligious group of many different religious schools in Mexico, and then also with Thich Nhat Hanh's. I've been able to Zoom with Thich Nhat Hanh's groups, and he has many centers in Latin America, many followers. So, and then also every week I've been Zooming with Zen en Español at the San Francisco Zen Center, which has been interesting. And we have people from all over Latin America in there. But it's been interesting we're doing Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind in Spanish. And it's been interesting for me, because that was the book we used when I first started with Roshi. He would do a chapter every time we met. And it's the same now. We're doing a chapter. It's 40 years later in another language, but it's been very insightful to see the text again and think about it and see which parts of it stand out for me. And so maybe in conclusion, let's see. Oh, yeah. So it's not to say, we're not oblivious to the situation we're in. And one of the things that came out in Suzuki Roshi's book was how he talks about accepting things as they are. I hadn't looked at that in terms of sitting practice so much, but I think what he was saying was that for his students at that time, confronting difficult situations in Zazen is really very challenging. And so just to accept it as it is, accept things as they are. And then he, of course, referred to that as a training for our daily life. And we can, of course, apply it to all the situations we encounter. I just got news yesterday that, and I think some of you are in my group, the Windsor Zen group, that they just sold the Lomitas Center. And we've been there maybe 4 years. It's a community center. It's a refurbished schoolhouse, very old schoolhouse, but with a lot of wonderful, maybe karma, you could say. Wood floors and everything, refurbished very nice. And the original owner, after it was a school, fixed it up really nice. And we had a good situation. We were the local custodians and getting a discount, but the owner said she had to sell it because of the pandemic. And so October we'll not be able to go there. And I have to admit, I was attached to the place, and but it's a loss, it's a death in a way. But it's a new beginning as well. So something new is in store for us, something we can welcome. Suzuki Roshi said, this is at the end of his chapter called Marrow of Zen. In continuous practice under a succession of agreeable and disagreeable situations, you'll realize the marrow of Zen and acquire its true strength. And I wanted to mention one other thing as we close. Yesterday I was joined our Sangha for the morning sitting. And it was very, very touching and wonderful. I usually sit in the morning later, and sometimes it's like, well, when do I sit? And maybe now, oh, do this, and then maybe. But to have a fixed time early in the morning, it was very special to be sitting in the dark and before sunrise and with the Sangha. And it did remind me of being, in Japan practicing and getting up very early. So I would encourage you, if you're not sitting with the Sangha in the morning, to try it. I heard an interview, it's kind of funny, an interview with His Holiness, and he recommends sitting. The interviewer says, well, how long should people sit? He says, well, I recommend starting with 3 seconds and then increasing a little, 10 seconds, and work your way up, And he says, well, how long do you sit? He said, I have 4 or 5 hours a day, but start small, and maybe you can start 1 or 2 days a week and see how that feels, and build up. I'll try it too. So it's a beautiful way to start the morning, and you feel that deep silence and quiet. Okay, you don't always feel you're sitting in the afternoon and people are awake, Okay, thank you very much. So I don't know if we have time for a couple comments or questions. Does anyone have a question or comment? All right, well, thank you very much.
Merit of this penetrate into each thing in all places, so that we, with all sentient beings, together realize the Buddha